Welcome back, Source Nation. You're listening to Sports Tuesday with Steve Manderson.
My featured guest tonight is a very accomplished author, done many novels. This particular book I am very interested in is pertaining to boxing, and I haven't done a boxing show in a while since my guest was Hector Camacho Jr. The title of this book was intriguing. The name of the book is Max Baer and Barney Ross, Jewish Heroes in Boxing, and he is Jeffrey Sussman. Jeffrey, how are you?
I'm very well, Steve. How are you?
I'm doing fine.
To hear it.
Two interesting names in boxing from the past. First question, why those two? What was intriguing about those two boxers that made you want to do the book?
Well, Max Baer was an interesting heavyweight fighter. First of all, he was the only Jewish heavyweight fighter in the 20th century. Most of the Jewish boxers were, welterweights or middleweights or lightweights. And he also fought Max Schmeling, who was Hitler's favorite boxer. He fought him in 1933 before the famous bouts that Max Schmeling had with Joe Louis in 1939. And it didn't get that much publicity, I guess, because we weren't on the verge of war with Germany at that time. But still, Hitler had come to power in 1933, and Max Schmeling was his favorite boxer. And Max Schmeling took an incredible beating from Max Baer. Max Baer, according to Jack Dempsey, had the hardest hitting right fist of any boxer in the 20th century. And his bout with Max Schmeling, which you can see on YouTube, is just an incredible fight. From the beginning of round 1 until the referee had to stop the fight in round 10 because Max would have killed Max Schmeling. It is a completely one-sided bout where Max Baer just completely dominated his opponent, and Max Schmeling didn't know what to do. And it kind of made Max Schmeling, a little while anyway, persona non grata with the Nazis, because he was supposed to be a Superman representing, the white race, the super race, the Aryan race, and here he was being beaten by a Jewish fighter. The fact, that Hitler disparaged the Jews, he disparaged blacks, he disparaged Asians, and for a member of one of those minority groups to completely whip and dominate Hitler's favorite boxer was a world-shattering event for the Nazis. And it made the Jews in New York at that time feel that they finally had a champion, someone that was heroic and could stand up to the Nazis. My father attended that bout at Yankee Stadium in 1933, and he said it was just a fantastic fight. He said it was one of the most exciting bouts he had ever seen in his life.
Oh. Now, beating Max Schmeling, were there many repercussions because of that, and being that, Max Schmeling was Hitler's favorite boxer? How did he feel about this? How did he take it?
Oh, Hitler was angry as hell. And it was funny because in 1935, Max Baer starred in a movie called The Prize Fighter and the Lady, which is actually a pretty good movie. And Hitler had the movie banned in Germany, not only because Max Baer was Jewish, but because Max Baer had defeated Hitler's favorite boxer. They wouldn't let the movie be shown there. He kind of demoted Max Schmeling for a while, and then when Max Schmeling lost to Joe Louis, years later, they stuck Max Schmeling in the paratroopers and hoped that he would get killed. And they parachuted him into a battle in Greece, and he was badly wounded and was put in a hospital for a while. And Hitler just tried to dispose of the guy and get him out of the way. He was very disappointed in him.
Oh my God, that is crazy. Now, he did lose to Joe Louis, and this fight was at Yankee Stadium. In fact, both the Schmeling fight and the Louis fight was at Yankee Stadium. The Joe Louis fight, 88,150 people attended that fight. That had to be the highest attendance of any event at Yankee Stadium at that time.
I think it was, because for the Max Baer, Max Schmeling fight, there were 60,000 people in the stands, and for the Joe Louis-Max Schmeling fight, there were even more people.
Now, in that loss to Joe Louis, how did the public take that fight?
Well, in New York, during the first Louis-Schmeling bout, people in New York were very upset about it because they wanted to see Joe Louis really beat this guy. And then in the rematch, Schmeling got knocked out in the first round. Joe Louis hit him with such a hard blow to his liver, right in the center of his midsection, that it caused Max Schmeling to collapse. And people in New York went wild. They thought it was fabulous.
Oh, unbelievable. Unbelievable. This record was very impressive, 68-13. And tell us about Ernie Schaff.
Oh, Ernie Schaff got killed after a fight with Primo Carnera, but prior to his fight with Primo Carnera, Ernie Schaff had fought Max Baer, and Max Baer, in one of his early fights, had accidentally killed a fighter named Frankie Campbell. It was one of Max Baer's early fights, and he hit Frankie Campbell so hard that he wound up killing him. And Max Baer felt terrible. He didn't fight for the next 6 months. He felt so guilty. And then for the next 6 fights that he had after that, he donated all the money to Frankie Campbell's widow. And years later, when Max Baer became a wealthy man, he helped to pay for Frankie Campbell's kids to go to college. He felt he owed them that. So Max Baer was basically a very kind, very generous man, and he had a lot of respect for people who got into the ring he fought against. He thought anyone who did that had a lot of courage. And, you know, when he died, 5,000 people showed up at his funeral, and all the pallbearers were former heavyweight fighters, including Joe Louis, who was one of the pallbearers at Max Baer's funeral. He was really, in many ways, a beloved figure in boxing, and even outside of boxing.
Now, were Max Baer and Joe Louis, did they become friends? How was that relationship?
Well, it was interesting because Max Baer and Joe Louis had a fight also at Yankee Stadium, and it was unfortunate. Max Baer had 2 broken hands at that fight, and his manager arranged for him to get shots of Novocaine in each fist. However, the fight was delayed because of rain, and they started the fight at 11 o'clock at night, and by that time, the Novocaine had worn off in Max Baer's fists. And he was just about defenseless because he couldn't use his right fist, which was his big weapon. So, you know, Joe Louis really creamed him in that fight. And 6 months later, Max Baer wanted a rematch after his hands had healed. And Joe Louis was willing to have a rematch. But Joe Louis's manager, a guy named Mike Jacobs, didn't want to because he was worried that once Max Baer's fists were healed, he might be able to knock out Joe Louis. And the reason he was so worried about that is Mike Jacobs had a contract with Joe Louis that awarded Mike Jacobs 10% of every fight that Joe Louis had for the rest of his career. And if he lost the heavyweight championship, he wouldn't have been worth as much to Mike Jacobs as he was as the heavyweight champion. So for those economic reasons, Mike Jacobs wouldn't let Joe Louis and Max Baer have a rematch.
Oh, wow. Wow. How was Max Baer able to go on after the accidental death of Frank Campbell? I know he stopped fighting for 6 months, but what made him go on after that? What was the motivation?
Well, he was basically a poor person, and he needed the money, and he didn't have any other skills. For many, many generations, boxing has been a way for the poor kids to try to earn a lot of money very quickly if they were good with their fists. And, you know, most of them are not college educated. They have few opportunities in the business world. You know, most of the ones who succeed and become champions have a real natural ability, and they figure, you know, I might as well use it and do the best I can with it. But, you know, towards the end of his career, Max Baer was so worried that he could really hurt somebody with his right fist that he often pulled back in fights and kind of wouldn't deliver that final knockout blow because he was so worried that he could do permanent damage to an opponent.
So a lot of his fights were more or less TKOs or decisions.
Yeah, a lot of them were TKOs. Very few of them were decisions. If you can imagine this, in his day, in the 1930s, he was as popular in his day as Muhammad Ali was in his, in that Max Baer was very handsome. He was very clever, very witty. Women loved him. He was always dating beautiful actresses and models and dancers and movie stars. And he was always being written about in the gossip columns of the day and being featured in magazines and so forth. And he loved that life. He loved being sort of a playboy. And for him, boxing was just a means of making money. I interviewed his son for this book, and he said, if Max could have succeeded as an actor or a comedian, he probably would have done that, because boxing, is a brutal sport. If you don't like really hurting other people and you don't like getting hurt, it's a hard way to make a living.
Well, I'll tell you, he appeared in several films, a lot of them comedies, which some included Abbott and Costello and stuff, and it seemed like if he chose to, he would have done well. His son, as we all know, famous for his role as Jethro on the Beverly Hillbillies. I'm curious, though, I remember the show. Did his father ever make an appearance on that?
No, his father died too young. Max Baer Sr. was only 50 years old when he died in 1959. But Max Baer Jr. told me a funny story. He said when he was in college, he asked his father to teach him to box. He thought maybe he'd like to become a boxer, and his father wouldn't let him become a boxer. So he asked his father to teach him some things about boxing. So his father took him out into the backyard of their house in California, and they put on these very big, puffy gloves so they wouldn't hurt each other. And Max Baer Sr. said, I'll teach you how to punch and how to jab and how to deliver a right cross and an uppercut and so forth, but we won't hit each other in the face and we won't hit each other hard. And the son agreed. After about 10 or 15 minutes of sparring, Max Baer Jr., for some reason, lost it and delivered a hard right cross to his father's chin. And the next thing Max Baer Jr. knew, he was lying on the ground looking up at the sky. His father had knocked him out, and his mother was hanging out of the second-story bedroom window shouting at Max Baer Jr., saying, "What did you do? What did you do? You killed our son. You killed our son." And Max Baer Jr. said that was the last time he ever put on a pair of boxing gloves.
Oh, my God. His build when on the show, he was a big guy. And
oh, yeah, Max Baer Jr. was over 6'4". All the Bears were very, very big. Max Baer's mother was 6 feet tall, and his sister was 6 feet tall. And it turned out that when Max Baer was a teenager, he really didn't like to fight. He tried to avoid fights, and if someone tried to pick on him, his sister would actually defend him. But one night, this was during Prohibition, Max Baer Sr. and some of his friends went to a dance, and they saw a pickup truck parked outside, and there was a big jug of wine in the pickup truck, and they decided to drink it, and they polished off the whole jug of wine. And the jug of wine belonged to a lumberjack, and he saw these kids drinking his wine. He took out after them, and they all started running away. And Max Baer was in the back of the crowd running, and the lumberjack reached Max Baer, grabbed him by the collar, and swung him around and punched his nose. It didn't faze Max Baer. He was amazed. He just stood there for a moment, and then automatically he reared back with his right arm and let go with a hard right to the lumberjack's chin and knocked him out, and the guy was out for about 5 minutes. Well, a boxing promoter saw this, and he said to Max Baer, "Have you ever thought of becoming a fighter?" And he said, "No, but my mother is a big fan of Jack Dempsey, so, I'm sure she would like it." And that was the beginning of Max Baer's career as a boxer.
Now, Jack Dempsey was in his corner on most of his fights, is that correct?
Yeah, Jack Dempsey sort of regarded Max Baer in a way as his protege. They looked similar. They had big, strong builds. They were very tall, and they were real sluggers. I mean, they were real hard fighters. The only difference is that Jack Dempsey was much more serious about his career as a boxer than Max Baer was. Max Baer just loved going out on town at night and being with friends and having a good time. And it was very hard for his managers to get him even to train for a fight.
Okay. Now, he was 7-0 before he lost his first fight to Jack McCarthy. How did he handle that first loss?
Well, he realized after his first loss that he needed to learn more. And his manager, Ansel Hoffman, wanted him to learn more. And he was glad that he lost that fight because he figured now he'll train a little harder. And he did. And he trained very hard for that, and he won his next few fights until he lost to a guy named Tiny Abbott, and then had a rematch with Tiny and knocked him out in the 6th round.
This is a fight where he got disqualified because he threw a punch while Abbott was being given the count.
Right.
And the fine back then was $100. Now, I guess in today's day and age, that's peanuts compared to probably what it was back then. $100 meant a lot of money back then.
Yeah, well, it was the beginning of the Depression, and, you know, you had millions of people out of work and, you know, people who were only earning a couple of dollars a week. So, yeah, $100, you know, could be a salary for the average working man of 2 or 3 weeks at that time.
Mm. Now, his first, 26 fights or so, he was out there either in Oakland or Los Angeles. Was those outside rings or was that closed in?
I think that there were a combination of open and closed rings.
Mm.
He was born in Northern California, and as he was coming up, he fought for what was called the Pacific Coast Championship. And after he won that, then his manager and he moved east and came to New York.
Mm. How was he accepted in New York? I mean, fighting at Yankee Stadium, and then there were fights at Madison Square Garden. The East Coast crowd, how did they accept him?
Well, you know, initially he came and he was almost like a celebrity. So they were fascinated by him. If you can just imagine, you know, let's say Muhammad Ali before he fought Sonny Liston. He already was a celebrity. And that was similar to the state that Max Baer was in. He came to New York and he was already a celebrity because he was dating all these beautiful women and going to nightclubs and having a good time. And so they were writing about him in all the newspapers. So they were eager to see him fight because they had heard so much about him. And, you know, he had a good record by the time he came to New York.
Okay. Overall, what is your assessment of what Max Baer, the kind of boxer, how would you rank him as far as the boxers of that era leading up to now? What place would you rate him?
You know, I'm trying to think, you know, Ring Magazine, I think, rated him like in the low 20s or something like that. I'm not sure. I don't have it in front of me. But, I mean, there were obviously fighters who were much greater and better fighters than he was. You know, certainly in the heavyweight division, Joe Louis was the most dominant fighter of the 1930s and 40s. And, you know, he could seemingly beat just about anyone. And Max Baer, he tended to rely a lot on just having this very powerful right fist. And in most cases, if he could just connect with his right fist, he would probably win a fight. But he was more of a slugger than a boxer, whereas Joe Louis was a much more skillful boxer. You know, he trained, he was very agile, he could carry a fight for a while, sort of like Muhammad Ali could. He could, you know, jab and jab and jab away and then look for an opening and deliver a series of combinations that would absolutely devastate an opponent. Max Baer wasn't that kind of fighter. I mean, if you look at him, you know, he had these kind of wild swings, and he would go after an opponent, you know, just try to pummel him with that right fist of his, and it was like a sledgehammer.
Sort of like George Foreman was back in the day.
Right, exactly.
He would move around. He had a fist on him. When he hit you, you pretty much went down. Yeah.
Exactly.
Yes. Now, Barney Ross. This is an interesting boxer to say. His real name was Dolph
Rostovsky, right.
Yeah. And he fought in the lightweight, the light welterweight, and welterweight class. 5'7". He was short.
Yeah, he was a small guy, and he was the first fighter to hold 3 titles simultaneously. And his story was very interesting. His father owned a small grocery store in a poor Jewish ghetto neighborhood in Chicago called the Maxwell Street Ghetto. And 2 hold-up guys came into the grocery store and shot and killed his father one day. And Barney was sort of running with like a street gang of young, tough kids. And his father was a very religious man and wanted his son to follow in the same religious tradition. But after his father got shot, Barney lost all of his interest in religion. And one of his closest friends in that gang at that time was a kid who was then named Jacob Rubenstein. But as he grew older, he shortened his name to Jack Ruby, and he became the man who shot Lee Harvey Oswald in Dallas, the guy who killed President Kennedy. And Al Capone, the gangster, took an interest in these 2 kids, and he said to Jack Ruby, "You have the makings of being a gangster," but he told Barney Ross, "You don't have the makings of being a gangster, but you're a very good street fighter, so you may want to think of a career as a boxer." And Barney said to him, if I become a boxer, I want to be able to reunite my family, because after his father was killed, his mother had a nervous breakdown, and his three siblings all went into foster care. The whole family was split up, and Barney wanted to reunite his family. So Al Capone, surprisingly for a gangster, arranged for him to have a trainer and then helped him when he turned professional. And when he turned professional, Al Capone made sure that all the tickets for Barney Ross's bouts were bought because Barney would get a portion of the proceeds from the ticket sales. And eventually he got enough money together, he was able to buy a house, and he was able to get his mother out of a mental institution and his siblings out of foster care and all together in one home again. And he went on to have a terrific run as a fighter. And he had a famous trilogy of fights in the 1930s with a guy named Jimmy McLarnin. Now, Jimmy had a manager who, I don't think he liked Jewish fighters, Jimmy's manager. I don't think Jimmy cared one way or another. But Jimmy had defeated 6 Jewish boxers before he encountered Barney Ross. And as a result of that, he got the nickname of being the Jew killer. That's how they reported him in the paper. He was the Jew killer. So there was a lot of pressure on Barney to defeat this guy. So in the first fight, he defeated him. In the second fight, he lost to him. And in the third fight, which was held in what was then the Polo Grounds in New York, where the New York Giants used to play, Barney won that third fight. But Jimmy McLarnin's manager, a guy named Pop Foster, was so upset about it that he went to court to try to get the decision overturned. And the judge said, well, what reason do you have for wanting to get the decision overturned? And he said, well, one of the judges in the fight was Jewish, and Jack Dempsey had a Jewish grandmother. Therefore, I think they were prejudiced against my fighter. And the judge said, you're crazy, and laughed the case out of court. But it really showed what kind of person this guy Pop Foster was. I mean, he just didn't like Jews. What was also interesting about Barney Ross, he lost his welterweight crown to a fabulous fighter. I don't know if you know too much about him, a guy named Henry Armstrong, who was the inspiration for Sugar Ray Robinson. Henry Armstrong, probably the best welterweight fighter of all time. And Barney was really getting beaten very badly, and this was his last fight. And he had never been knocked down in a fight, never been knocked out. And he could have accepted a punch and gone down on the canvas, and that would have been the end of it. But he was determined to stay for every single round of that fight. And he stood up, and he was a bloody mess, and he lost, and he knew he would lose. But he said, I'd rather take a beating than be knocked down, and I'm going to go out on my feet rather than on my back.
He had an impressive record, though.
Very impressive.
72-4, 22 wins by knockout, 3 draws, 81 total fights. That is impressive.
Very impressive.
Yeah, and especially in his weight class. Who was his close friends in the boxing industry?
Well, oddly enough, later on in life, he was friendly with Joe Louis, and then later on, he also became very friendly with Rocky Marciano, who became the heavyweight champion in the 1950s. And it's not in my book, but there are a couple of photographs of the two of them. And actually, he became very good friends with this guy, Jimmy McLarnin, after their bouts. Until the day Barney Ross died, he and Jimmy McLarnin exchanged Christmas cards every year and birthday cards. So, even though Jimmy McLarnin had this crazy manager, Jimmy McLarnin was basically a pretty nice guy. But what was interesting also about Barney Ross, after he retired from boxing, he opened a nightclub in Chicago, and when World War II started, he felt that America had given him a chance to succeed, and he was very angry that the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor. So he wanted to enlist in the Marines. And they told him he was too old. He was 32 years old at the time. So because of his connections with Al Capone was able to pull some strings, and Barney was able to enlist in the Marines. And during basic training, they used to call him Grandpa. But he proved to be a very good soldier, and they sent him to Guadalcanal to fight the Japanese. And one night they sent him out on patrol with 3 other Marines, and they were ambushed by a Japanese platoon. And 2 of the Marines were immediately killed. The third one was badly wounded, and Barney pushed him into a ditch, and then he jumped in the ditch on top of the guy. While he was jumping into the ditch, he got shot in the thigh and shot in the foot. And throughout the night, he took all the rifles that they had, 4 of them, and used up all the ammunition shooting at the Japanese soldiers. When he ran out of ammunition, he took 24 hand grenades between them, and he threw these hand grenades at the Japanese all through the night. By dawn, it turned out that Barney Ross had completely wiped out the Japanese platoon. And he received in the Rose Garden of the White House from President Roosevelt a Silver Star for heroics. And he saved this one other Marine. He carried him back to base, even though he was badly wounded. The unfortunate thing was that because of Barney's wounds, he had to undergo 6 surgeries, and they gave him a lot of morphine in the hospital to kill the pain. But he became a drug addict after that, and he lost all of his money buying heroin on the street. And he finally, when he reached bottom, he put himself into a drug rehabilitation center in Lexington, Kentucky. And he was told that it would take a year for him to become completely clean. And he did it in 6 months. He was so determined. And when he got out, he spent the rest of his life lecturing college and high school students on the dangers of drugs. And he was very honest in telling them, what he went through and how horrible it was, and whatever you do, don't become addicted because it'll ruin your life. And there were 2 movies made about his life later on. One was a fictionalized boxing movie called Body and Soul with John Garfield, which is one of the great boxing movies. It came out in 1947, I think. And it's a beautiful black and white movie. And then a number of years later, I think it was in 1951 or 52, a movie came out called Monkey on My Back, which was about how he went from being a champion boxer to a drug addict and how he overcame his drug addiction. But Body and Soul is a much better movie and a terrific story.
Now, being how he ended up, how was he mostly remembered? Was he remembered for the tremendous boxer that he was, war hero, or drug addict? How was he mostly remembered?
I think he's remembered as one of the great lightweight and welterweight fighters of all time. I think he's ranked in the top 10 of those weight divisions. He was also called a scientific boxer. In other words, he would, kind of play around with an opponent, figure out what the opponent's strategy was, and then concoct in his own mind a terrific offense for defeating that guy and understanding what the other opponent's vulnerabilities were, what his weak spots were, what his hardest punches were, how to stay away from those punches, and how to penetrate his opponent's defenses. He was a very, very smart, thoughtful fighter.
What were the relationships? Max Baer and Barney Ross, the relationships with their managers, because sometimes that could be touch and go with boxers. And were they close with their managers?
Well, Barney Ross had a business-like relationship with his managers. It was close, but, they weren't close friends. Max Baer's manager was almost like a father figure to him, a guy named Ansel Hoffman, who was very interested in making sure that Max Baer took good care of himself. And Max Baer was very generous with his money. If a friend was in need, he'd give him the shirt off his back. So, Ansel Hoffman made sure that Max Baer invested his money into annuities so that he would always receive money every month of his life after he retired from boxing, especially if he didn't have any other source of income. An example of how generous Max Baer was, he won the title against a man named Primo Carnera, who was the tallest boxer who ever fought. I think he was almost 6'8". And Primo Carnera was controlled by a bunch of gangsters. And when he lost his fight to Max Baer, the gangsters had no more use for him, and they deserted him. They stole all of his money, too. So in that fight with Primo Carnera, Max Baer had knocked him down 11 times in 11 rounds. And he finally said to the referee, you should probably stop this fight, because this guy's getting hurt, and I don't want to hurt him anymore. And still, Primo Carnera had a broken jaw, he had a broken rib, and a broken bone in his forearm. And Max Baer paid for all of his hospital bills. He felt that since these other people deserted him and he caused these injuries, that he would pay to make sure that Primo Carnera was taken care of. And he arranged for Primo Carnera to have a post-boxing career as a wrestler, where he was able to recoup all the money that had been stolen from him by these unsavory managers. And when Max Baer died, Primo Carnera was in Italy, and he couldn't be there for the funeral, but he flew to California the following week, and he had his driver take him to the cemetery where Max Baer was buried. And it was at night, and the gates of the cemetery were closed, And Primo Carnera and his driver climbed over the fence. They found Max Baer's grave, and Primo Carnera knelt at the grave, said a prayer, crossed himself, and then said to his driver, "Max Baer was the best friend I ever had." I mean, it just goes to show you the kind of decent person that Max Baer was and why so many people loved him.
Yes, I see. Now, in Barney Ross's case, what the relationship between him and Al Capone, how would you describe that? Was that a close relationship or carefully guarded type of relationship, being who Al Capone was?
He started out basically as a runner to Al Capone's bookie joint. He's just a low-level kid off the street, and Al Capone liked him. He thought he was a nice kid, and he felt sorry for him after his father was shot, and he saw that this kid could become a boxer, and he was a gangster, so he also figured he could make some money from it, as well as help him out. But he didn't have a close relationship with him. So after Barney Ross retired from boxing and opened the nightclub in Chicago, a lot of the people who worked for Al Capone used to hang out at Barney's nightclub, along with a lot of other, professional athletes, baseball players, football players, other boxers, and so forth. It was sort of like in its day, we would call it a sports bar today, but I don't know what they called it in those days.
More like a speakeasy, I think that's what the term was back then.
Maybe, yeah. It was in the late 1930s.
Did Al try to get a piece of Barney's action in terms of fights? Did he try to work it that way, or did he leave that alone?
I think he pretty much left that alone. I think there may have been some boxing promoters who owed him, and he probably got a piece of that. But nobody owned either of these fighters. As a matter of fact, just before Max Baer's bout with Primo Carnera, some gangsters came into his dressing room, and they told him that they wanted him to lose the fight to Primo Carnera, and Max Baer told them to take a hike. And for some reason, they never did anything. They just left.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's interesting, because you would figure a situation like that, what, you say no to us, we'll take care of you,
Exactly. That's what was so strange. But they may have felt that the string had sort of played out with Primo Carnera, that they had used him, for so many years and made so much money, and they probably figured that he was sort of at the end of his rope at this point anyway, and they were all set to abandon him, which they did after that fight. They probably felt they couldn't squeeze any more money out of him.
Did Barney Ross have that same situation with Capone, or Capone pretty much left him alone there and just didn't want him to throw any fights or anything like that?
No, he never asked him to throw any fights, and he never got involved in trying to influence the outcome of any of those fights. He really believed, that left alone, Barney Ross would probably win most of his fights anyway.
At any point, did he want a piece of his nightclub?
That I don't know. I don't know anything about that. It wouldn't surprise me, but, the way that a lot of those things worked is, rather than owning a piece of the nightclub, they control what goes in and what goes out of the nightclub. So, they supply the liquor, they supply the food, they supply the linens and so forth, and that's how they make their money.
Well, I don't think Barney would say no to that. I mean, really.
Al Capone got him started in fighting, so he sort of owed him.
Yeah, that is true. That is strange, though. A relationship with somebody of Al Capone's stature, and pretty much he was left alone, didn't throw any fights at Capone's request. You figure that's kind of rare.
Yeah.
A lot of times in situations like that, you just got to count your blessings.
Yeah, that's right.
It is what it is.
There was a gangster here in New York named Frankie Carbo. He fixed one fight after another at Madison Square Garden. And if you didn't do what he told you to do, you were in bad shape. But neither Baer nor Ross had any contact with him. They were fortunate. Actually, he came a little later. He came in the 1940s rather than the 1930s. Probably one of the most famous bouts he fixed was a bout between Jake LaMotta, the Raging Bull, and a guy named Billy Fox, who was no match for Jake. I mean, Jake would have creamed him very quickly, but they told him that if he wanted a shot at the championship, that he had to take a dive for Billy Fox, because that's what the mob wanted, and he did it.
One of the last questions before I let you go, and I thank you very much for coming on.
It's my pleasure.
Do you see the difference, and I say the way Barney Ross and Max Baer grew up in the fighting industry, is there a difference between what they went through and what today's boxers go through. I know difference is a lot of money, the purses, and they back then pretty much played for peanuts. But in terms of the work ethic, do you see much of a difference between the boxers of that era and what we have today?
I think that in some ways, the boxers who came out of the Depression era were really hungry because it was a very bad time in America. 1/4 of the population was out of work, and guys who had been making a ton of money on Wall Street were selling apples on the street just to feed their families. So the boxers who came out of the 1930s, they were very, very hungry. Max Baer Jr. told me that before his father became a boxer, he worked on his father's ranch. It was a small ranch in Northern California, and his father paid him 35 cents a night to slop pigs, which meant that Max Baer Sr. had to get up at 3 o'clock in the morning, go around to all the restaurants, collect their garbage, bring it back to the ranch, and feed all the pigs. And for that, his father paid him 35 cents a night. Well, when Ansel Hoffman got to manage Max Baer, he was able to get between $35 and $50 for a single fight. And that doesn't seem like very much to us today, but if you're only making 35 cents a night, it was a big difference. And, even if he made $50,000 for a championship fight, it's nowhere near, what home box office and HBO and pay-per-view and all these things can generate in terms of the millions and millions of dollars. So in those days, a fighter just had to keep on fighting and keep on fighting and keep on fighting in order to earn enough money. In these days, you can have one major championship fight and retire as a multimillionaire.
Yeah, that is true. It doesn't seem like today's boxers are hungry enough as compared to what it was back then. And even back then, they didn't have the only kind of media would be at that time radio.
Radio, and they had what were called newsreels. They would film the fight and then show it in a movie theater between the two movies. Or it was the equivalent of like pay-per-view. You could go to a movie theater a couple of days after the fight and watch a film of the fight in the movie theater. But that was it. And, between radio and newsreels, that didn't generate a lot of money. Like the Mayweather and Pacino fight, they split $130 million, something like that, between the two of them. Neither one ever has to fight again. And Pacino really didn't have to fight before that either. He's a senator in Manila. He's not exactly a guy who's, groveling for coins on the street.
No.
When Sugar Ray Robinson started fighting, he was a really poor kid. And it was a way of earning some money. Before he became a boxer, he was dancing on the sidewalk and people would throw coins in a hat.
Oh, like a vaudeville performer, pretty much.
Yeah. So, you look at all those really great fighters, Joe Louis, Sugar Ray Robinson, Henry Armstrong, Max Baer, Barney Ross. I mean, these guys were really hungry. They needed the money very badly.
Yeah. They earned their paychecks.
They sure did.
For sure.
Yeah. Yeah, they had the scars to show for it, too.
Yeah, that's true. Well, I think today's boxers need to take lessons. Actually, they need to get your book. That's what they need to do. They need to get
I hope you're right. I hope they get it.
And, for those that can read, and be grateful that you're fighting in modern times, because I don't think today's boxers will ever survive in the 30s and 40s. That's for sure. No.
Yeah, it was a tough time in those days. Real tough.
That is true. Well, Jeffrey, this was a pleasure.
Well, thank you for having me.
You're welcome on Sports Tuesday anytime. The invitation is out for you. I definitely got an education on Max Baer and Barney Ross and those boxers of that era. Where can they get the book?
They can get it at Amazon.com or BarnesandNoble.com.
Okay. And
I just want to remind them of the title. It's called Max Baer and Barney Ross, Jewish Heroes of Boxing.
Yes. Okay. And what is your next project? I know guys like you got something going right now.
I'm writing another biography of a very interesting boxer from the 1940s and early 1950s named Rocky Graziano.
Oh, yes. Well, we definitely got to have you back when we talk about that once that's completed.
Yeah, that should come out sometime around November or December.
All right. I'm going to mark that down. So that's going to be interesting. He was one of the great boxers of our time. That's for sure.
And a fascinating person also. His whole life story is just a terrific story.
Can't wait.
Thank you.
Well, Jeffrey, I thank you very much, and we will definitely talk down the road. So you take care, and God
You too.
bless.
Same to you. Blessings.
All right. Take care.